And I believe we are now streaming live on Facebook. I'm Mark Ainley from the Piano Files. I'm here with Ira Levin, who is a phenomenal pianist and conductor, with whom I've been having some really insightful conversations over the last few years. And in some of our recent talks, we realized that these are topics that really need to be discussed and publicized more. And that's one of the things that I've been doing on my Facebook page and presenting historical recordings, something along the kind of playing that seems to really resonate with Mr. Levin, with his training with Georges Boulette and other great musicians. And so we are here for you. We're here live in order to have a conversation about some of these issues. Mr. Levin, thank you for joining me and for being willing to have this conversation. So for just a little background introduction, I first came across your playing, Ira, through our mutual friend Gregor Binko, who founded the International Piano Archives. I believe it was when I was in New York in 2008. And Gregor and I have always had a fondness for the great romantic pianists. And anytime Gregor presented me with the playing of a pianist who was actually alive, I always paid attention because I knew that it must be a very high recommendation. And he had a copy of your CD of piano transcriptions that he handed me, and I was completely blown away. And it's still a great favorite. And so I've been delighted to be able to talk to you about all of these issues, that kind of great playing of the past, the great music making of the past, which I think is a topic that's you're very passionate about as well.
Indeed, yes.
Yeah. Now,
yes, and not only concerning pianists.
That's it.
Yeah.
Great musicians, and you know, they were all. I think all of the great musicians have been after the same thing, in a sense. And there's a transferable, in a sense, a transferable quality to the energy that they would bring, as much as they all had their different flavors, perhaps. But there's something to the intrinsic nature of their craft that we can hear.
Yes. Yes.
Now, you made a post recently that really struck me on your Facebook page just a few days ago about live music making and the need for musicians to be connected beyond the repertoire that they're playing. And I wonder if you could maybe just express that verbally, because some of our viewers won't necessarily have seen that, and to discuss some of those topics.
Well, yes. I mean, I think it's absolutely essential for all musicians to know the historical and cultural background of the music they're playing. I mean, there's no point in even looking at a Schubert piano sonata, for instance, without knowing his song cycles.
Yeah.
I mean, one of his other songs as well, the leader. The A minor sonata, Opus 42, quotes one of his leader. If you don't understand what that song is about, and I'm not going to say which one it is, but you know, then you're not understanding the first movement of that sonata. And we can multiply that thousands of times. I mean, I've always been a very curious person from the age of 10 or so when I started about 9.5. So we're talking a little over 50 years. And I've always been a passionate and very curious musician. And I still am. And I find that the more I enrich myself and know about the times in which the composers lived, in the literature of the times, the art of the times, the more I know about that composer, you know? And this is something that all the great musicians of the past was as part of their training. If you read, for instance, the memoirs of Arau, studying with Martin Krause, they didn't talk about piano technique. Krause brought them to museums. He brought them to the opera. Yes. He brought them to, you know, and then they practiced 6 or 7 hours a day. But it wasn't just, okay, learn how to master an instrument or learn how to beat, you know, time. No, it was a whole cultural background, you know, and all the great musicians I knew personally, worked with or met, you know, had this kind of background. I mean, having a discussion with Mr. Szlachowski or Boulette or Max Rudolph was something, you know, stunning, you know. and most of that generation. So I think, for instance, yes, I'm still a pianist. I think I play better now than I did when I studied with ballet. But of course, I've been conducting for 35 years, and I've conducted 95 operas, and I've conducted hundreds of other things as well. So I have that experience behind me, and it makes a huge difference. For instance, when I sit down to play a Mozart piano concerto, and I know, and I've conducted dozens, hundreds, maybe, of performances of his operas. But then you know the connection between Figaro and the C minor concerto. They're, you know, one's 491, the other's 492. You know, you hear in the finale of the G major concerto, that's a comic opera finale. You know, if you don't know that, first of all, you're depriving yourself of a lot of enrichment, but also it affects the way you play. If you know that's that finale of the G major concerto, the presto, the last after the variations, then, and you know the finales of Figaro or whatever, or Così, or even and Führung, then you play that differently. You have to understand, because the instrumental grew out of that, the instrumental works. You know, if I'm playing Beethoven sonata or conducting a Beethoven symphony, and I don't know his string quartets, I'm lost. Sometimes I've told orchestras, I'll stop in a passage and I say, no, you have to play this like the coda to the Beethoven Opus 95 quartet. And some of them look at me like, what language are you talking in? You know, I mean, that's impossible. Every string player should know that work, and every conductor should know that work. If you don't know, you know, I mean, I can give you thousands of examples.
Yes.
You know, and often I've been sitting, I've seen in the opera, rehearsing the orchestras, which is basically what I do, you know, and the orchestra will see a bunch of chromatic scales in front of them, in Wozzeck, for instance, and they play them chromatically, you know, in the scales correctly and in time, but without any atmosphere. And then I stop and say, does anyone here know what this is? Well, no. Well, this is where Wozzeck is drowning in blood with the moon, the red moon. And also, then the orchestra sound changed. So you can apply that to anything, a pianist, a conductor, a string player, a singer, you know, it's part of the culture. And if you're not knowing that, you're lost, in my opinion, you know. So that's something that I'm always pushing on the people I work with, most of the younger people, but some older as well, once in a while. But I noticed immediately, you know, a violinist comes to me and says, we were doing the Sorcerer's Apprentice of Dukas, and he came to me and said, you know, that Dukas wrote this for Disney, for the movie Fantasia. No, this was written in 1897, you know, things like that.
Yeah.
And so if you don't know these things, you're reduced to instrumental mastery or vocal mastery, and what your teacher basically tells you to do, or which recordings you like the best, but it's not coming from you.
Yes.
You know,
yeah.
It makes a difference. It makes a difference.
Well, huge. Yeah. I mean, this is a lot of what we've been talking about, is the intelligence and, you know, the different intentionality within not just the mindset, the overall state, and the overall, you know, the raison d'etre of the musician. And
yes, absolutely.
Musicians that we listen to were not just, as you're saying, it was not mastery of the instrument. Mastery of the instrument was there to serve something much.
Absolutely.
And what you're saying,
just to give, we're talking about piano playing basically today, but you can apply it to every discipline. Conductors, you know, in the quote old days, I would say up until even after the Second World War, there were no conducting classes. You did not go to the university and study conducting. You played piano. You began, in most cases, working in an opera house, assisting someone, playing piano rehearsals, playing, you know, for the singers, staging rehearsals, and then maybe you got your break someday, and you were actually asked to conduct something.
Mhm.
And then you moved up and you learned by doing, and of course, watching the great ones. Many conductors later made huge careers. Many of them were influenced by Arthur Nikisch, or watching Richard Strauss, or whoever the case. In Italians were watching Toscanini, and there's, but I mean, so they did learn by watching.
Yeah.
But they did not learn how to conduct. So if you look at videos of these conductors, for instance, every single one of them has a different, quote, technique.
Mm.
And some of them don't have any technique, according to today. If you watch Furtwängler or Klemper, if you got up in front of an orchestra like that today, they would just, laugh. But they were supremely great performers, and we still listen to their recordings today.
Yeah.
Today, you see everyone, or I'm exaggerating, of course, to make a point, but you see kind of a generalized way of conducting today.
Mm.
It's not an individual. If you take a group of conductors, you'll see basically, I can name some names of who their models are, I believe, but I won't.
Yeah.
I have to be diplomatic. But I mean, there's not this individuality, because the others developed on their own. Mm-hmm. They had to express what they had in them, and by whatever means. And that's what came across to the musicians. It's not just a matter of beating cleanly. Yeah. And it's the same thing about piano playing, or violin playing, or singing. Mm-hmm. You have to express first what's in your inner ear, and then what's in your mind.
Yes.
And then you find that comes by itself.
Yes. And so, go ahead. I mean, yeah. It's a whole different approach. I mean, and the intention is, in a sense, that you are there expressing what it is that you want to express about the music, versus I'm here as a performer who is only doing quote unquote justice to the score, doing the intention of the composer, this sort of this worship of the score that loses sight of, I think, the humanity, which you spoke about in your post, like who was this musician, under what circumstances writing this music, but also the personality of the musician, being allowed to have a personality, and perhaps express not quote unquote clean, whatever clean is, in terms of technical precision, the nth degree of precision being primary to whatever the emotional.
Absolutely. Let me just ask you a question. Of the following pianists that I off the top of my head will name, how many do you think would get past the first round of a competition? Schnabel, Edwin Fischer, even Horowitz, Richter on a bad day. For instance, just give it a go. None of them. Schnabel, Fischer, Horowitz, I heard many times, and he sometimes played a real mess, but I didn't care at all. I mean, even in the 30s, some of his recordings are not clean, but he had an awesome technique. But the difference was that technique, as he himself used to say, Horowitz said, and Horowitz told me that, because I met him a few times and heard, and he said, technique today is considered how fast and clean you can play. Technique is not that. Technique is projection of mood, projection of color, whatever the case. Mm-hmm. There are all kinds of accounts of Liszt and Anton Rubinstein, and of course, certainly Arthur Rubinstein, but let's stick with the 19th century, playing boatloads of wrong notes, but yet reducing people to tears. Mm-hmm. I mean, there wasn't this obsession with being clean, but I mean, I think that has many sources. The most, it was the strongest one being the influence of recordings. Mm-hmm. I mean, when you put something down for posterity, it's quite a different thing than just getting up there and performing. I mean, I've recorded several CDs, piano CDs, and I recorded CDs, 5 or 6 with orchestra, with the London Symphony and Scottish National Other Orchestra, and so on. Okay. I have a film of my recording session in Abbey Road with the London Symphony, playing work by Michael Kalina, American composer, Capriccios, which we recorded. And I have a film of it also in YouTube, conducting it in Sao Paulo. And the one in Sao Paulo is like a performance. I'm freer, it's wilder. Mm-hmm. And when I see myself on the film of the recording session, I look like a professor, because you're in the back of your head, you're thinking, oh, this is going to be forever. You know, at the moment of a performance, it's forgotten. Max Rudolph used to tell me, Furtwängler's performances were a mess, always were, technically. But they were so powerful, so riveting, so, you know, possessed, that you didn't even notice. But when you listen to a recording and you listen to a passage 20 times and you hear the same mistake, and you know before you get to that passage, oh, the bassoon's gonna flub up here, or whatever the case, or the strings are gonna fall apart, then you don't have that magic anymore. So when you're recording, you do have that in your mind. Everybody does. Mm-hmm. And the audience is also used to that, you know? So that means less risk-taking and more self-consciousness, mm-hmm. and all kinds of factors come into play. And then the public is also used to that. So then, you know, what do you hear many times, even the comments on YouTube, for instance, oh, at 5 minutes and 34 seconds, there's a wrong note, ha, 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 or this or that. You know, I played Rhapsody in Blue once in São Paulo with the Ozesky Orchestra, and it was quite a wild romp, and the audience loved it, and the guy who'd written Gershwin biography came up to me and said, you know, he's just raving about how wonderful, blah, blah, blah. And there were a couple of posts after that. One guy wrote, because it was broadcast, I heard 22 mistakes. Ah, excuse me, then don't go to a live concert. But unfortunately, that's what has happened. And that's also the case with competitions. Yeah. So now you go to a competition, and we were talking about individuals. So you have, how many on the jury? I don't know, 8, 12, or whatever the case. And they have to arrive at a decision. Mm-hmm. Okay, in my opinion, every great artist is extreme. And the larger they are, the greater the heights they reach, the greater they fall. You know, there are performances of Furtwängler which are incredible, and others which I think are unbearable. And the same with Toscanini, and the same with many others. Horowitz, I heard many times, could play within one recital like a god, and the rest of the time like I won't say it. And many others. Everyone admired Busoni's Bach, mm-hmm. and Beethoven and Liszt, and mostly hated his Chopin. Mm. But if you do that at a competition, you're going to polarize. Mm-hmm. And so the judges won't be able to reach a census. That's right. You know, if you have someone who's so extreme, or Sviatoslav Richter, something like that, or Glenn Gould. I mean, there are people who worship Glenn Gould like a god, and others who think, you know, he's the 666. So I mean, you know, but obviously a genius in his, you know, I mean, so if he goes to a competition, he wouldn't pass. That's right. Absolutely no chance, because you'll have someone on the jury going, oh, I have my Henley book in front of me and my Carl Philipp Emanuel Bach book in front of me, in which it says how to play this, or I don't like that approach or whatever, but you'll have someone else who loves the playing of Edwin Fischer, mm-hmm. or whoever else in Bach. And, you know, so we have this unfortunate tendency, mm-hmm. to judge things today in such situations by extrinsic things instead of intrinsic. Yes. You know, I mean, I couldn't care less how someone plays Bach if I'm convinced by it. I love Edwin Fischer, and I love Adolf Busch, mm-hmm. conducting and playing Bach, mm-hmm. but I also love, you know, things of Bull, and I love certain things of other people who are more specialists in Bach, and I love it on the harpsichord, and, you know, I love Karl Richter's Bach, but I also like some of the early music performances of Bach. I mean, yeah. What's the point of trying to reproduce or whatever by a formula? We have to try and reproduce that. Why? Or that everything should be, that there is one way, in a sense. Yeah, that's the thing. This is, I think, part of it is where the intentionality of, like, again, why are we making music? What's the point of making music? Right, and in a sense, by the nature of a competition, I mean, there's a non-musical primary intent, which is to win the competition, which is to get the approval of the judges. So it's actually no longer really about the music.
because there's these
No,
other
I was,
needs that are
yeah,
there that are filtering down, just like you described being in the recording studio. There's the non-musical sort of concern of precision, which can be part of a musical performance, but when that sets the bar, when there's fear on the line or when there's any kind of restriction on the line, then all of a
right.
sudden, none of these great composers that we're speaking of, restriction, they were all ones who broke actually the
Oh,
constraint
absolutely.
of what had been done before. So there wasn't, restriction
Absolutely.
wasn't the name of the game. So when we start bringing in, and not to say that we then just do whatever we want willy-nilly kind of thing, but it's more the matter of true personal vision.
It becomes true, yeah. The moment it becomes a dogma. For instance, I stopped conducting Bach and Handel many years ago, and I adore Bach. I mean, all I have on my iPad is Baroque music,
Mhm.
But I mean, basically, because I don't perform it anymore, I don't need to have, from basically Haydn on, because I perform all that. I just, but I mean, if I want to hear that music, I listen to that. But I stopped performing it myself because I had some performances of Handel oratorios and operas and things of Bach, which I gave in the past, which were very well received,
Mhm.
But many of the reviews began with, something like, oh, it was very good, excellent, but what a shame he didn't use original instruments, or what a shame this or that. I mean, it was already listening with a preconceived idea.
Yes.
And you have that, of course, with everything.
Yes.
You have people who go to the opera and want to hear their Callas performance that they have at home reproduced that evening,
Mhm.
or their performance of whoever playing the Emperor Concerto, or conducting the Schubert Ninth, or whatever the case is. And then, I've had run-ins with various critics, and when I sometimes I go to the point where I sit down with them and say, well, listen, what did you base your review on? One of them became my best friend, and after a performance of Beethoven Ninth, and it came out that he was basically kind of expecting me to be Furtwängler, and I said, well, but Furtwängler does the first movement of quarter note to 44, and Beethoven writes 88, and writes Verzweiflung on his sketches, which means despair. This is not a mystical thing. This is a despairing movement, and you don't have to do 88, but you can at least do quarter note to 70 or something in the range, Anyway, so we got in this big thing, and he said, well, I think you're right. I said, so why don't you, before you write a review next time, look into these things instead of coming and go, I don't like that. I'm very open-minded. I really don't care if someone convinces me. I'm convinced. I'm just less convinced many times today. I was at the Chopin competition in 1980 in Warsaw, because I had won the American National Chopin competition. Ballet was on the jury, but was not allowed to vote for me, and was shocked as hell when I won, because I played wrong notes and I did it. But he said the mazurkas won it for you. And who was my greatest influence in mazurka playing? Friedman and Rosenthal.
Neither of whom would get past the first round of a competition.
No way. But somehow I did, and that clinched the anyway. I went to Warsaw after that, and I was one of, I think, 130 contestants. And that was a famous year, because that was the year that Ivo Pokorellik lost.
That's right.
But actually won because of the scandal. He became known. And I sat there because there wasn't much to do in Warsaw in 1980 except drink vodka and go to the Chopin competition and listen to the contestants. You sit there in a stupor listening to 20 people playing the second scherzo back to back, or whatever the case, or their group of the etudes. And, all perfect, but most of them kind of faceless, and then someone like Pogarella came up and was different. Yeah. And just what we're saying, he's the one who made the world career.
That's right.
I probably dropped too many notes to win or whatever. I don't really care. I never really gave a damn about any of that. But that kind of proves my point. Who went on to make the career? The person with the strongest personality, which was also a very polarizing type of playing. Sometimes he played marvelous things, and other times, but it was a personality, and that's what I'm saying.
Yes.
The bigger the personality, the larger the spectrum of, of whatever the word is. Yes, go ahead.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think that there's almost this belief that if we like something a musician does, we have to like everything they do. Like we're so black and white with our thinking that, you know, and also even just to appreciate or respect a musician. Like I can actually respect some musicians whose performances, by and large, I don't like.
Of course.
You know, and
Absolutely.
respect who they were and respect their individuality. And it's not my kind of playing. And we don't all have to like the same kind of playing. But I think that, you know, something that's happened with this sort of, you know, as Anna Russell would say, homogenous as in milk, you know, this homogeneity that we've created through competitions, through recordings, through this emphasis of clean, you know, no wrong notes.
Clean, poor text, whatever the hell that means.
Well,
I have to tell you something that Ballet once told me. And I must say, you know, yes, I studied with Ballet.
mm-hmm.
And when I went to study with Ballet, I was already immersed in the recordings of the older generation, shall we say, Hoffman and all. And back in those days, we had to like call a friend to get a copy of a recording. Now they're all out on CDs, but thanks to Gregor Benko and people like that, they're all out on the market now, or YouTube, you know.
Yes.
But back then it wasn't so easy. But I was already immersed in the playing of Friedman and Hoffman and some of the German greats and whoever else, you know, fascinated with Busoni. And Ballet was not I wouldn't say that was the greatest musical influence on me, in a sense. So when people say, oh, he's a ballet pupil, even that, for instance, I once played a Mozart concerto, and the critic who knew nothing wrote something, oh, it's obvious that he's a pupil of ballet. I didn't play anything close to the way ballet played Mozart, not, you know, but because my name said ballet, you know, so just having said that, but ballet, of course, was a huge influence on me. Mm-hmm. I was his assistant and taught for him as well, and, you know, spending years next to someone of that stature, and what he had to say is sometimes what remains more in my mind than what, you know, we actually talked about in lessons, because we didn't talk. I would play, and then he would play, and he would look at me and go, and I go, nah, and then I would play something else, and we went like that. You know, we didn't talk much at lessons, but we were very close outside, and some of his comments were very revealing. Like, he was ranting about the urtext, because another great pianist once wrote about Ballet. Oh, but he takes too many liberties, and well, but so does that other pianist who listened to his recording, considered today quite drastic in his liberties, as was Schnabel, for that matter. You know, I mean, Schnabel would not be accepted today by the conservatories. But and then Ballet said, you know, he had an autograph book of people who he heard in Havana, where he was born in the early 20s already. Everyone you can think of, every great pianist, every great violinist, you know. And he said, you know, back in those days, we used to go to a recital or a concert, orchestra concert, whatever, to hear what Hoffman and Rachmaninoff and Friedman and Cortot and Schnabel and Gieseking and whoever else, Moisevich, had to say about Chopin or Schumann or Beethoven or whatever the case. You know, like going to a play. I wanted to hear what the difference between John Gielgud and Ralph Richardson and Laurence Olivier's and whatever, Marlon Brando's Hamlet, or I don't know if Marlon Brando ever played Hamlet, but in any case, you go to a play and you see what that great performer brings out of that text. And that was basically a approach of these performers back then, you know? And I find that much more interesting, because, I mean, what's the point of going if you're not going to learn something about it or get some kind of insight? And I think that is something, I think that statement for me kind of sums it up. Yeah. If I go to a performance of a Bach or whatever, I don't, as I said, I don't care who's playing it. I don't care, you know, I want to hear what Mr. Arnoncourt had to say about it, or Karl Richter, or Adolf Busch, or Landowska, or Casals. And for me, they're all great, because they all give me food for thought. Yes. But it's not, oh, you can't do that. So this is something you started our conversation by talking about the great romantic pianists. I basically don't like that term. Yeah. You know, because that's too sweeping. You know, I wouldn't call Schnabel a romantic pianist or Edwin Fischer. It was a different way of thinking, an approach about piano. They had certain things in common,
Mm-hmm.
which you can usually hear on old recordings concerning pianists. A beautiful tone, a control of the pedal, which is something I think is an art that's largely lost today. There are a few exceptions, things like that. But otherwise, like we said before, they're all absolutely individual. You can never confuse Bachhaus with Schnabel.
That's right.
I mean, or ever confuse Rachmaninoff with Hofmann.
Yeah.
You know, they have certain things in common, yes, but they're absolutely individual.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't think you can say that today about too many. So, but I wouldn't call it romantic.
Yeah.
I would call it basically kind of pre-World War II,
Mm-hmm.
humanistic or whatever training they had, certainly before World War One, that really changed the approach to music and brought in also the more objective type of performing, the beginnings of and composing, like early Hindemith or the Stravinsky in the 20s, you know, turning away from the grand romantic gesture, which became kind of suspect, because look at the conflagration that came out of all of that.
Right.
You know, conflagration of all that humanity. What came out of it? World War One. That's why Busoni spent the war years in Zurich basically drinking himself to death, or ruining his liver at least, in the train station. Or later people like Stefan Zweig and the great artists, they were all in despair because the whole structure of the world they grew up and practiced their art in collapsed with World War One. And World War II was kind of the icing on the cake.
Mm-hmm.
So I mean, you know, then that all became suspect. You know, and I think that had a huge effect on performing. Certainly Stravinsky's comments about musical performance in the 1930s, which he later greatly diverged from, but basically saying no interpretation, music's not about anything, this and that. And that, I think, put the stamp for an entire generation on this objective, you know, don't put too much of yourself in and all of that, which is, I think, disappearing a bit today. But that, of course, for 30 years was basically the requirement. And there were certain great performers in that period. I knew many of them. And I won't mention any names, but I think it's very difficult in certain cases to even then tell the difference between great American pianist A and great American pianist B. Again, it's mostly in countries that were, quote, a little behind, like in Russia, where you have more individuals. You can certainly tell the difference between Hillels and Richter, for instance, or Feinberg. So, you know, it's a complicated subject, but I don't like this term romantic. Yeah. It sounds too, you know, but.
Well, the word romantic, there's a stigma. There's so many pictures associated with it and so many, you know, associations that are not accurate. So
yes.
And they weren't all, the ones from that generation were not all sort of romantically inclined or in the repertoire. And how
not at all. There are conductors, you know, people today, again, excuse me, but I have to be a little tough. These labels that are put on, you know, talk about romantic pianists or the great German conducting tradition, which many people today think means heavy and legato and all that, because that's how a couple of famous ones today did it, and certainly how a very famous conductor in the not quite distant past conducted. But that's not the German tradition. As I said before, there's a huge, vast difference between Klemper and Furtwängler.
Yeah.
And Wagner conductors, excuse me, Erich Kleiber, Richard Strauss himself, Fritz Busch, people like that, Keilbert did not conduct, Karl Böhm did not conduct Wagner with this heavy, whatever, you know, turgid kind of thing, which sometimes works. It's nice for Parsifal maybe, but not for the Flying Dutchman and Parts of the Ring, in my opinion. But whatever the case is, you can't say the German school of conducting. That's the biggest bunch of BS ever. You know, excuse me, whoever's listening, but that's nonsense. Just go listen to Erich Kleiber conducting Wagner and then put on Furtwängler or Knappertsbusch. and tell me, I mean, which one's German?
Mm-hmm.
No, it's not only German because you like that style. You could say you like that style, but that's not the German school. But that's used today for marketing and promotion. Oh, this conductor is following in the great line of German conductors. Which line?
Yeah.
You know, and the same thing with pianists and violinists.
And then when we think about pianists, I mean, you know, how many Polish pianists had to be, you know, and themselves, I heard from their relatives, despised being labeled as a Chopin pianist just because of their birthplace, but they all had different approaches. And sure, the understanding of the language and the idiom, there's definitely something you can get, you know, for understanding a mazurka or understanding somebody, of course. And you know, you listen to all these great Polish pianists play mazurkas, and they're not the same. You listen to Hoffman there's nothing that Hoffman's doing that's really like Friedman in the sense of you can hear.
Hoffman plays it with one mazurka quite straight.
Yeah.
Not with the extreme rubati or, you know.
That's right.
And holding the third beat. And the same thing you can talk about the traditions of conducting. Johann Strauss. Some put on, you know, an extra layer of Wiener Schmaltz, and some do it straight. And you know, it's not a rule that it has to be done like that.
Well, great music can be played more than one way. I mean, this is what makes it great, and this is why, you know, what you were saying about performance and acting. An example that I've used a lot. You know, we do not go to a theater performance to hear the words recited from the script. We go to hear acting.
Yeah.
So you go to hear, and not just the words, but what's behind the words, and what's the character, and what's the drama, and what's the story. And this is what the great musicians were doing. And so if they flubbed in the way that, you know, an actor might get tongue-tied and say the wrong word, or they might stumble, or they might spit, or they might, something that happens in the spur of the moment of a live performance, which is not a recording where you sit at home and very, you know, you're comfortable surroundings and let yourself be served anonymously by some device. You actually are in a shared environment, which is something that's, you know, the whole concept of shared space and safe space is definitely, you know, a topic for our times. And it's, we might not like it. And yet, what if we get to experience something a second time? Something I've been telling when I'm presenting these historical recordings to piano students who are, you know, perhaps in their late teens or early 20s and studying, you know, in an academic environment. I'll say is, you know, listen to it a second time, because the first time you might be so in your emotional reaction to hearing something that's completely different than what it is you're used to, that you're not actually hearing what's going on.
Yeah.
Because your reaction is so
reacting to the shock.
That's it. I mean, I still remember the first time I heard, you know, I'd heard so much about it from my high school physics teacher of all people, who was a great, you know, really knew his historical piano recordings about Hoffman's Waldstein. And the first time I heard it, you know, I just remember, I still remember where I was in the room looking at the album cover thinking, what is going on here? Because this is nothing.
And that's quite an extreme case. But don't forget that everyone I knew who heard Hoffman, and that was many people, said that every performance was different.
Yes.
So the Waldstein that he played that night, Hoffman was kind of a quicksilver type. He could play it absolutely dry and strict and academically, and the next night be a demon. You know, fourth ballade, that coda, which is like the cataclysmic. But the next night he could play it, you know, whereas Rachmaninoff was more consistent. But Hoffman is a very special case because he came very much from the school. Well, the school was basically Anton Rubinstein and Liszt, who never ever played anything twice the same way, in his own words, ever. And even improvised and this and that. And Anton Rubinstein also, according to the mood. It doesn't mean that the general contours of a work were not organized in their heads. Yes. But, and Horowitz certainly, you know, I heard say many times, every time I play different, you know. I mean, I heard Horowitz play the same piece in several recitals and with quite wild, divergences between them. So Hoffman, you have to be careful. That's not necessarily the way he played.
This is what we get used to when we have a record, we have a product, and it's like what you were describing, that this is what's here for eternity. And the challenge is, you know, we can latch onto that this is their vision, because we're in this culture now that you have one perfect vision. There is one ideal interpretation that each performer should be setting down. But why?
No, that's why Hoffman, for instance, and Rachmaninoff in general, did not want to record. So
Yeah.
it's what a shame that Hoffman didn't record the Schumann Fantasy or 111 or Don Juan or some of these pieces, or Busoni, you know, the Liszt Sonata, because we all know the letters of Busoni complaining about putting down 4 minutes of music. It took him hours and hours and hours. You know, Hoffman didn't want to show up, you know, one day, Tuesday at 3 o'clock, and say, okay, I'll play the Schumann Fantasy, which he played for 50 years. And then for posterity, that would be how he plays the Schumann Fantasy. Yeah. You know, I've had the same thing on my own recordings. I have some of the performances on my first CD of transcriptions. I don't like it all now. As a matter of fact, I just this week revised the scores of some of them. Mm. You know, I mean, I'm not comparing myself to them, but even in my little world, you know, because I recorded like one of those, the Toccata of Bach and F major, the organ Toccata, at 3 in the morning. And it's a monster to play anyway. And I was tired and being careful because it's for posterity. So that all went into the performance, into the recording, you know. So, I mean, all of these things are very dangerous. Or someone who hears one of the later recordings of Toscanini, which became more rigid in many ways when he got older. Say, oh, it's a terrible, he did a, excuse me. That was a 70-year career. And you know his recording not from 1954, but from 1936 of the Seventh Symphony or whatever the case is, quite a different performer. Mm-hmm. And we don't know what he sounded like in 1906. But they hear one recording and say, that's what Toscanini conducted like, or that's what Furtwängler conducted like. Mm-hmm. And all these stupid labels, Furtwängler's slow, Toscanini's fast. Yeah. Toscanini conducted the slowest parcel ever in Bayreuth, ever. Mm-hmm. And Furtwängler is a speed demon in many things. Listen to the coda of Beethoven's Ninth Symphony. Mm-hmm. It's so fast it's unplayable. No one's playing what's written. It's, you know, again, hearing that at the moment must have been hair-raising. On recording, I don't know. But, you know, so we're going back to the same things. And one thing that's also important, think of this for a minute. The average concertgoer in the late, let's say, 19th century, by which time the classical canon had established itself. So even late Beethoven was being performed by then, you know, took decades in public. But you could be in Vienna, a subscriber to the Vienna Symphony, Philharmonic, and not hear all the Beethoven symphonies in your lifetime. Much of the music they were playing was modern music, which in those days meant Joachim Raff as well as Brahms, and Max Bruch symphonies as well as Bruckner, and God knows how many obscure Italian opera composers, and not just Verdi. You know, the epic was not just Verdi; it was also, you know, many others, and who are completely forgotten today. And Beethoven was less performed in his day than Hummel or Spohr. And people, so I mean, we can't forget these things. So the programs in the late 19th century contained a lot of music of composers we've never even heard of. You know, the Leonore Symphony of Joachim Raff or things like that. And people who went to hear the latest composition of Brahms, let's say, okay, it was not in Carnegie Hall or some cavern, you know, with 3,000 seats. It was in a basically intimate setting. And or even later, recital by one of the great pianists, they were projecting music for an audience that did not hear it live often. You know, if you went and heard a premiere of a Brahms string quartet, or a piano trio, or a Bruckner symphony, or whatever the case, a Mahler symphony, it was a strong chance that you would not hear it again in your lifetime live unless you played it at home, which many of them did back then. We also don't have.
That's right.
Yeah. So these performers were projecting music. That's why von Bülow once played Beethoven Ninth twice in the same concert. Like, you know, because the audience was finding it rough going. This is a fact. I'm not making this stuff up. And so it's like, okay, like, you know, Johnny, take your medicine. You don't like the first time, so you'll listen to it again. And that was probably, for many people, the only time they would hear Beethoven Ninth in their life. We just go to our little room there, press a button, and there you have 95 versions on YouTube or on Spotify. So we can't judge these performers by our current day standards,
Yes.
ears, ways of assimilation.
Mm.
You know, many of these people, before they would go and hear a world premiere of Brahms or whoever the case, would play the work at home in four-hand arrangement or six-hand arrangement or whatever the case, or on two pianos.
Mm.
You know, Untitled Chapter talks about as a child playing all the Haydn string quartets with his family. You know, that makes a big difference when you hear a Haydn string quartet if you've played it as a child with your family. Who could name a family today who would have four string players to play through all 83 Haydn string quartets?
Yeah.
So I find any attempt, you know, to reproduce these things and call it Werktreue or Urtext, or, you know, it is for me a little misguided. Another great musician told me once, he said, "Isn't it funny that we have recordings of many people who were trained in the 19th century, pianists, violinists, whatever. You have recordings of Elgar conducting his own music. You have people conducting Mahler who worked with Mahler, Oskar Fried, people like that, and so on and so on. You know, but let's stick with pianists. So you hear these pianists and these recordings that we have, and you hear them rolling the chords. You hear them taking liberties with the text, and all that, and the purists go, oh, and the conservatory, you know, fanatic, oh, you can't do that because it's not like that in my Henley or Bernreich score. But the fact is, and this is a musical fact, that all accounts of the people's playing of their own works says that they did that. Brahms rolled every chord he played. Go read Florence May or other accounts of Brahms playing. Brahms, many times turning pages, they've rolled every single chord. If you roll a chord today, if you anticipate a left hand in the bass, but that's what almost all did back then. All.
And what's fascinating is everybody's saying they want to do, you know, justice to the composer and meet their intention, but then they hear something like this and they're horrified because it doesn't match
I don't
their
like
picture
that.
of what it was.
That's not what. That's what not what my teacher told me, or this or that.
Right.
And it's not perfect like on the CD. But then the absurdity continues, because then the same people who will put up their noses at the rubati and portamenti in Elgar's playing his own music, or other Mengelberg conducting Mahler, you know, oh my God. Then many of these people will then get a textbook by Quantz or Carl Philipp Emanuel Bach or whoever else, Leopold Mozart's Violinschule, and say, oh, this is how to play that music. Wait, you're basing it on a book, but when you have the recordings are not allowed of actual people from that time. But a book telling you how to play something that was written 200 to 300 years ago is allowed. And in many cases, they don't differentiate between even the styles of the regions. Leopold Mozart was not reading for worldwide consumption, writing for worldwide consumption. He was writing for basically his area in Austria, maybe Germany, but mostly Austria. They played with a completely different bowing and style in Venice than they did in Austria. And Hamburg played differently than London and whatever. You know, doesn't help you. It's not like everyone was played the same. There were different schools. And you can't, that's nonsense. But many people, because this said that every note should have this or that. No. And if we're going to recreate the past, then where's the creativity in that? Because the past is the past. We don't have their ears. We don't know their absorption was probably stronger than ours. You had musicians who were able to look at a continuo of Bach and know what to play, or look at a score of Handel, which looks sometimes very bare on the page, but they knew how to fill it up, like jazz players in a way. You know, give me the chord structures and I'll put in the rest. Well, that's what they did during performances of Handel operas and Hameau operas and all of that, because the training was there. No one today is trained like that unless you specialize in it, you know. But I mean, and everyone back then was trained as a composer as well. Everyone, Friedman composed, Schnabel composed, Glember composed, Furtwängler composed, Toscanini composed, gave it up after he got to know Wagner and Verdi's music, which was being written when he was a young man. But these people had a knowledge of composition. Sell composed, Dorati composed, Reiner composed, Hoffmann composed, whatever. It doesn't mean that they have to be great.
That's right.
Sauer composed, Rosenthal composed. Try to put together a piano piece like Rosenthal's Papillon or some of his fantasies. You can put up your nose at it, and but try to do it, or Godowsky for that matter. So, and we can't recreate the times in which they lived. If someone wants to recreate a Baroque performance or a cantata like it was in Bach's time, maybe the St. Thomas Kirche, then have the audience coming in and out during the performance. Sometimes the wealthy people with their dogs. Have people going into the opera where the people were sitting in the main floor on benches, uncomfortable benches, or during one of Bach's passions and complaining about it for 3 or 4 hours, while the aristocracy above was coming in and out to hear their favorite aria or see their favorite diva, and meantime being served or leaving the box for a while, go have some sex with their favorite, whatever. And you can see that when you go to the opera house in České Krumlov, or if you want to reproduce a Baroque opera, okay, then let's have basically an orgy going on up in the boxes, and everyone's sitting on comfortable wooden seats downstairs, maybe bringing their lunch with them.
Candlelight, wear the wigs. Where do we draw the line in terms of what's authentic?
Exactly.
We can't.
Exactly. Nothing.
The music was, and your recent post was really about live music making. That's what you were talking about.
Yes.
And back then it was new, and then nowadays we look back on this as old music rather than with the freshness that even if it's not music of our time, it was once new, it was alive. And this is something, for example, when you hear Marcel Mayer, who I know you and I both adore, you hear her play Rameau, and it's alive. And you don't care if she's starting her ornaments on the upper note or lower note. You don't even notice because it's in the line and it's alive and it's breathing and it's not this dusty, rigid kind of stuff, these dusty...
Yeah, because she brings it alive, yeah. And it's not just about where to begin the ornament or... I have a funny story. I just remembered, I haven't thought about this for years. I spent 1 year at Indiana University before going to Curtis with Bollett. I began with Bollett at Indiana, and then after a year he left for Curtis. So I was only in college for 1 year. But there was a girl I was quite interested in, and there was someone from the harpsichord faculty who was also interested in her. And nothing ever happened with us. But I knew that one time she went out with this guy, and so I asked, so, what was it like? Oh, he was so boring. He spent the entire time talking about embellishments and couperons. Well, talk about losing the forest through the trees. Yeah. And that's what I hear in many performances also. It's like they're trying to teach us, okay, this is how you do this trill, and this is how you play this bow. And in case of pianists, this is how it has to be. I think one has to be undogmatic and open, and one has to change.
Yeah.
I know I've changed a lot as a conductor over the past years. I was kind of a schizophrenic case. As a pianist, I was squarely in the, as you put, romantic pianist, thing, very subjective and all that. And as a conductor, I was more in the kind of objective side of the fence. Toscanini, Mavrinsky, Reiner, Sell. And now I'm Ira, in both. In my conducting is more like my piano playing. Right. I must say I've gotten freer, and I'm, kind of in the middle somewhere. But this is after, vast amounts of work and thinking and all that. It's not because of listening to a recording and saying, oh, I like that, so I'm going to try and do that. Yeah. I'm going to try and be whoever now. It's okay to do that when you're younger. Everyone has their models. Yeah. Of course. And you can see that even in some great conductors into old age who influenced them. There was one conductor who I was sure he was influenced by something. And then years later, I read one of my great influences was so-and-so. I won't mention names.
Yeah.
That's absolutely normal, but then it becomes something of your own later. And that's what people talked about, trying to copy Nickish. Reiner said he went to a Nickish rehearsal of Oberon, where there's a sudden, it's held, and then that comes out. And Reiner was amazed how Nickish did that, technically. So he was all excited. So he scheduled it for his next concert as a young conductor, put on the Oberon Overture and got to that point and did exactly what Nickish did, and it fell completely apart. That's the point. You can't try to be Hoffmann. He's inimitable.
That's it.
Porto, Schnabel. And it's
they were themselves. I mean, this is what we admire about them, is they were being themselves as opposed to trying to be someone else. And I think musicians trying to be who the audience is going to like, who the judge is going to like, who the recording contract, the recording lawyers are going to like. And so it never becomes really about who they are being,
no.
Also who they are beyond their role as a music maker, as a quote unquote performer, which is different than an interpreter. And they then lose, like you're saying, they lose the forest for the trees, and they're not even on the landscape. They're on the map, and they're not even in the territory.
Well, yeah, I mean, that's absolutely true. And as a performer and someone who has to get by, in the performing world, in the swamp that is the music business, or was the music business. I mean, that's all, a lot of what we're talking about is gone up in the air now anyway.
Yeah.
There are some, well, I wouldn't say positive sides to that, but the music business became an absolute commercial swamp, in my opinion, and the opinion of many, many great musicians, a lot more famous than I am and whatever, especially somewhat older ones like myself, and whatever the case, you do get to the point where if you're thinking about programming something, there are so many examples. I belong to an international Bruckner forum. I've recorded a couple of Bruckner CDs. I'm no Bruckner expert, but as much as I am an expert in anything else, I've read everything available about Bruckner. So I have my ideas and I know about the sources. So I have my clear ideas. So a work like the Fifth Symphony, which for many years was performed magnificently on its own terms, but not necessarily having to do with what he wrote. And there are some conductors who had the guts to do it, who were very firmly established. But if you get up there and do certain works which have established themselves with certain tempi and whatever traditions in a major music center, there's a strong chance that you might be ostracized or crucified by the press, because again, you didn't do it like the way they want to hear it, or someone more famous than you has done it, and because the press says he or she is from the great German school of conducting, which doesn't exist because there's about 4 or 5 of them. This is the danger. So sometimes it does even affect repertoire choices.
Yeah.
If I play a transcription here, they'll go, oh, he plays transcriptions. That's one of my, insane making points. Going back to Curtis and before people, oh, how can you play transcriptions? I said, excuse me, didn't you just play the Bach D minor piano concerto last week? Yes, well, that's a transcription, dear. And did you know that Bach took the first movement of his E major violin partita and turned it into the first movement of a cantata, number 29, with chorus, organ, and full orchestra? Did you know that Bach took secular works and used them in the Christmas oratory with sacred texts? Did you know that the B minor Mass is a parody of several cantata movements, maybe the greatest work ever composed, but he didn't write it all at one time. He took it from many, many sources. Only the credo was new,
right.
And these people who don't know that, I could tell them that the Agnus Dei aria is from cantata number 11, but they couldn't tell me that. But they could. That's why many people hated me. But I said, what's the problem? But before you make a stupid comment like that, why is it okay if Beethoven makes a transcription of his violin concerto for piano?
Well,
but it's
actually,
not the case in this.
When Schnabel's wife, when Schnabel, was it Karl Ulrich Schnabel's wife, Helen Schnabel, when she recorded that in Vienna in the 1950s, the orchestra gave her a hard time with that. They
Yeah,
would, it was really challenging because it was not what was done.
no, and it's not terribly well done. You know, doesn't detract anything from Beethoven. It was business. It was business. Mozart reorchestrated Messiah, Artis and Galatea of Handel, arranged Bach fugues, string trio, and so on down the line. So, but I mean, why is it okay if Brahms writes Hungarian dances, but if Liszt writes much more creative Hungarian rhapsodies, that's not good, because Liszt was a virtuoso and Brahms was, quote, serious and German. You know, all these labels, this blah, 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 blah. So I used to get these people get their blood going when I would say, but you're playing transcriptions all the time, and you don't even know it, you know. And so, you know, again, no dogma, please. Just listen.
Well, this is the interesting. I mean, this leads into the whole, you know, our role as not even role as listeners. But, you know, part of the whole mindset. What I'm interested in. Why do we want to go hear things the way we already like them? Why do we want to go hear something that's already going to fit within our parameters, when really every life-changing, life-enhancing experience we've had, there's been an element of surprise, there's been something that's new, there's been something unexpected, there's been something that's different, the first time that you tasted the food, the first time that you went to a certain location. And so why do we want to go hear a great piece of music done the same way?
I don't.
The way that we already, it's beyond me.
When I'm not working here in Brazil, where I've had some leading positions, but in my apartment, we live in Berlin. Yeah. And people say, oh, Berlin, you know, you live in the culture camp, how marvelous. I said, yeah, but I mean, I don't go to concerts. I mean, because most of the concerts are with standard repertoire. And I really don't need to hear a Brahms symphony anymore, or whatever the case, you know, thousands of other pieces. Like, what's the point of going to what I, in my opinion, usually hear are extremely well, flawlessly performed performances of works that I've had, that I've heard thousands of times, literally. And if in the case of a piano work, then I prefer, in many cases, not, of course, there are certain great artists who I greatly admire, like to hear live. But in most cases, in my case, for instance, if I want to hear a work of whoever, I sit down at home and I play it on the piano. And I'm concentrated with the music, because I'm not getting from most performers today what Ballet said about going to hear what those performers had to say. I only think there are a few performers today who have something to say about whatever, so I want to hear what they have to say. But otherwise, what's the point? And, you know, so it's very complicated, and it's not, it's something that's not going to change. Now we have this horrendous situation with the virus. And the music business, there was a post the other day that it was basically been destroyed as we knew it. And God knows when it will come back. I hope it'll be possible for me to conduct an opera again someday, where people are actually playing together in an orchestra pit, in a chorus scrunched together on stage. We'll see. I mean, I'm of course concerned, like thousands of others are, millions, and all people in the arts, you know, not to mention the rest of the world. It's you know, just in complete despair. But I mean, I'm very curious to see what comes out of this. What I find disturbing is that everything we're talking about now could become even more pronounced if we're not having the experience to hear it live. You know, these videos that you see, I mean, I posted a couple of things myself, and, you know, I have things on YouTube. And yeah, sure, you know, you want to reach people, and I'm happy when a few thousand people watch one of my things on YouTube, or my CDs are selling well, or whatever, you know, of course. We're all, but that doesn't replace the real thing. And my fear is that these collages of people in their apartments with the headphones on and synchronizing a Mahler symphony or a Verdi chorus, or whatever the case, is going to become the norm for a while. And then we're getting even more sterilized and further away from the source in which this great music was composed, you know.
Well, I'm really hopeful I think people are just going to be, I'm hoping people are going to be so clamoring for having that live shared experience and being able to be in the same space, you know, once we can, that I'm hopeful that, you know, this is where it's going to go, and that this is just filling in a gap as necessary, so people can actually have that experience of making music to whatever degree they can within the, you know, current circumstances. That we don't
Yes.
becoming the norm. There's no.
But I'm curious to hear. I mean, now that we have all the things we're talking about now,
Mm-hmm.
these are things that, you know, are so easy today to study. That's what my post was basically about to my younger colleagues. And, you know, it's so easy today to go to YouTube and hear anything. You want to hear how Joseph Joachim played Bach? There it is in YouTube. You want to hear the difference between Adolf Busch's and Karl Richter's and Gustav Leonhardt's Bach?
Mm-hmm.
There it is in YouTube. Everything's there. You know, you can find texts to books. I used to have to write to Paris libraries or whatever else to get obscure, you know, works of Liszt or Alkan. Now you go to IMSLP, I sit here petting my dog, you know, having a glass of wine, and there are the complete works of Liszt and Alkan in front of me, you know, or whoever else, or the complete operas of whoever, or the complete cantatas of Bach, the scores, you know, which I used to take out from the library or buy. Now I have them all on my computer, the complete cantatas of Bach. I mean, it's the easiest thing. So take advantage of that today during this period, especially, you know. Yeah, this incredible richness that we have that's available.
We're so fortunate, really. I mean, having and being able to listen to these recordings, and what, like you were saying, like what did we used to have to do to get a recording of Hoffman?
Oh my God! You know, now it's out on 2 CDs, but the Hoffman, the Moonlight Sonata performance, the live one, which for me is one of the
it's
the greatest.
Eye-opening. I posted that on my page, and somebody I know who's recorded the Beethoven sonatas twice, so he said, "Well, thank you for turning my world upside down before 10 a.m."
Yeah,
I mean, it's completely.
No, I mean, whatever you think of it, it's something so off the charts for someone listening today. You know, and the first time I heard it, I thought, my God, this is what I've read about always, accounts of Anton Rubinstein or Liszt. This projection of something almost occult, you know, that went beyond the instrument. Why could Liszt sit at a ready spinet and bring people to tears? Because he had in his head somehow this projection of something from his mind, through his fingers to, and you hear that on this Hoffman. But you know, the first time I heard it was at a very famous restorer of recordings, and I went to visit him once from Curtis. He lived around Philadelphia, so we're talking at least 40 years ago. And he handed me a cassette. You would think it was a scene from like a James Bond movie or something, you know, or some thriller about, you know, the Eastern Europe after the Second World War, you know, the Third Man or something. He handed me this cassette and said, "Don't tell anyone that you have that. There are people who would like break into my house to get this." And I went, and it was a cassette. It was this Hoffman performance. You know, no one knew it. And he said, "Don't play it for anyone, because if word gets out, it'll be, you know, all hell will break loose." So, I mean, that's how I first heard Hoffman play the Moonlight Sonata, and I've been listening to it for 40 years. Now it's on YouTube. I mean, it's so easy. So, you know, take advantage of this time and go there and take advantage of these riches and try to enrich yourself and get out of these dogmas.
These narratives and these dogmas, in a sense, these frameworks. You know, one of the interesting things that Patty said was, first of all, he talked about the or spirit instead of the or text, which I think is just such a great, you know, such a great connection, just also to bring in the concept of spirit. But he said that, you know, any music that's played beyond the era in which it was created, never even, to begin with, never conformed to the rules and regulations that were in place at the time when it was written.
No, you can't base anything on account. That's why I said anything on accounts of the past. No. You know, there's a big among conductors or even among pianists. Should we play on original instruments? Well, if you're playing a 9-foot Steinway grand and you're trying to reproduce a Pleyel from 1840 or a Broadwood from 1826, then I think you need to seek some kind of medical help, because so why play the Steinway grand? So the same thing with a modern orchestra. Yes, I think one has to have awareness of Baroque practice, and that doesn't mean that there aren't great performances today. Of course, I heard the other day the violinist Sato playing Bach sonatas and partitas on a remade Baroque instrument. Fabulous. I never heard them play better from anyone. Not the historical ones. Are fabulous. Of course there are performances like that too for people who go beyond the technical thing.
Yeah.
But you have this whole debate in orchestra performance. Okay, Bach had his performance, his cantatas performed by boys in the church basically, and sometimes two violins in a part or whatever. But there are also letters of Bach asking for more instruments. Mm-hmm. We'll never know if Bach always wanted them to be played that way. Certain cantatas work that way. Other cantatas with these fantastic opening choruses, they work with Joshua Rifkin conducting with 4 voices on one part, but they also work for me with 40 voices. Mm-hmm. I don't think with 100 voices. Mm-hmm. I'm kind of middle row. But I mean, in any case, we don't know if Bach would have liked it or not. But let's take Mozart. Mozart conducted the world premiere of Don Giovanni in Prague in 1787 with 4 first violins, which would be much too small for any opera house today. But of course, it was a small opera house, the Thiel Theater in Prague. Mm-hmm. But he also performed his Paris Symphony, an earlier work, with 40 violins and wrote home, thrilled with the sound. Haydn, the first performance of Haydn's Creation took place, basically in an assembly hall, a huge hall, or Beethoven's Eroica in the Lobkowitz Palace. And people today say, oh, it took place in with only 6 violins, whatever. Yes, it was in a room in a palace with a very live acoustic, and it probably sounded like 100 people. Yeah. So, but you can't go to Carnegie Hall with that, or whatever, to the Met.
I mean, you change one factor in the equation, the whole equation changes. I mean, they didn't have lighting, like electricity. There's all these things, and the acoustics, like you're saying, the size of the hall. What are the people doing? As you were saying, are they actually sitting and paying attention? All of this, the sense of, it's ironic because we're trying to recreate. That they're trying to recreate, like you were saying, on these extrinsic, sort of by the book.
It's all extrinsic.
Right? We have this intrinsic nature of like that or spirit as opposed to the or text.
Nonsense. We have the original parts for Haydn's Creation I think it's for the first performance. And again, it was in a closed hall. It wasn't a concert hall. Yeah. And he had double woodwinds. 4 flutes, 4 oboes. So if you performed a Haydn symphony today or Mozart with, doubled winds, so 4 on each part, oh my God, Yeah. But that's how it was. You know what? An orchestra with 16 winds, that's bigger than some Mahler symphonies only call for triple winds. Mm-hmm. And here you have Haydn's Creation for quadruple winds, played in a closed hall like that, with a chorus of over 100. And it probably sounded like Mahler's 8th Symphony or something in a hall like that. Mm-hmm. So what's the point of getting to a modern recording and saying, okay, this is now, quote, authentic, or we're reproducing this because Haydn would have done it with 2? It's all bull. Because also the recording process, people today listen to a clavichord. I wonder how many people who listen to a clavichord on a recording have actually heard a real clavichord. I mean, a clavichord has the sweetest sound and all that, but you basically have to really get almost next to the instrument to listen to it. But if you hear it on a recording, it sounds like E. Power Biggs playing the biggest organ in the world, right? Because it's mic'd like that, or a solo violin can sound like, like dozens of violins. You think, my God, that's a violin, like an organ. That has nothing to do with reality. Nothing.
Now, if I can take off from there, because then, since we are, we're, of course, all of these things are transferable to piano, and, you and I both have the
yes.
in common, and we're doing this on a piano page. But all of this relates, but I think you and I have discussed as well. I mean, the sound of the instrument on recordings versus in the hall. I mean, this is a big challenge, and I think this is one of the challenges is we can hear something that's so, we can think perfect, even if it's not really the real thing. But we get accustomed to the sound of a piano in a recording, and then you go to a live performance. Oh, but they make mistakes. You have to deal with other people, and you can't hear it as well. And all of a sudden, the live music making and the live music experiencing situation seems to be less attractive to people who want to be a little bit more spoiled, shall we say, and a little bit more comfortable.
Or stimulated because of the same way in movies.
Yeah.
That's almost impossible today. It would be almost unthinkable today to make a movie like 12 Angry Men, let's say. Mm-hmm. Just 12 men in a room with a great script and great acting and no props, no special effects, no one being, a superhero comic book kind of figure or whatever. That's almost impossible today because that's interior. Mm-hmm. And for many people today, especially younger people, there are not enough thrills. There are many people who won't even watch a black and white movie today, So there is a little bit of that element in music too, and the marketing. We haven't even gotten into that. I mean, we won't talk too long or the audience will want to kill us. But the whole marketing thing, it wasn't necessary for Myra Hess or Clara Haskell to come out wearing, short pants or wearing a sexy dress showing. I don't think most people wanted to see that, them or Gina Bachauer, but they were great artists, or Landowska. I mean, the marketing of things today, in many cases, is so absurd and so extreme, and it just proves that music is not enough. Mm-hmm. It needs the video component. Even rock music, when I was a young boy and growing up, the Beatles albums were coming out every year. My brother would come home, my older brother, and with the latest Beatles album. And you listen to it, 100 times and this and that. But today you get a new album and there's immediately a video image with it. It's like the music's not enough, You made your own image of Lucy in the Sky back then with diamonds and didn't have to watch someone doing it for you. And
that's right.
Everything today is, I need the image with it. So now you would have to have someone playing or doing this or, sitting like this and voluptuously playing and showing. And what is that?
Yeah.
Nothing. Nothing.
Wouldn't it, in a sense, sometimes, what would it be like if, you didn't have to look at the performers? In a sense, it's the irony because you're at home and you listen to a CD and you're not looking at the performers, but you're also not in the same space and time location as the musician who's playing, whereas in a concert you are. But then there's this visual component which really doesn't necessarily add anything to the experience per se, and should. And now it's turned into this whole, you can tell that the musician is feeling because they're making, X number of facial expressions per minute or so on and so forth, when how many of the great musicians really, there was none of it.
Very few. And it's even worse with conductors, because if you look at most films of the conductors from the past, and today, the brass are entering, and there's a change of chord, and they go, and here, isn't that beautiful? And they smile, the chord changed. And we can hear that the chord changed. And I can tell you, as a conductor with 3 decades of experience and knowing thousands of players, that doesn't make any difference to the players, quite the opposite. The last thing a brass player needs from them before a big entrance is, Richard Strauss wrote, don't even look at the brass because they'll play too loudly if you do. Well, but that's true. And today you go, and the people who are not listening but watching, look how passionate he is.
That's right.
But if you listen to his passionate performance and then compare it to a film of, Reiner or Mavrinsky or the Germans or whoever, those Canadians, you think, my God, this is much more passionate, but I don't see any facial things going on. So all of these things, again, there are certain musicians who paved the way for that, but with them, it was a part of their persona.
Yeah,
it really was. I worked with Bernstein. He came into rehearsal the same way he was on camera the whole time. It was marvelous. He came in. I thought, my God, he's the same in rehearsal as he is. That was part of him, or the part of him that needed to be like that. I had a talk with him, and he was not like that. He was serious, and he could be, but he had that when he got up on the podium. That was something that was echt. It was really the real thing. Yeah. But I feel that people who are not even remotely close to being a Bernstein feel this becomes something essential, for instance, or certain pianists who have to, you know, effuse with every note and look up at the ceiling while the chord changes. And it's not going to make it's not going to make the ending of 111 more ethereal if you look up or if you look down.
That's it. Yeah,
you know?
or you close your eyes, or you know,
close your eyes, or
yeah, and this is the challenge though, is then it's, you know, in a culture that's so appearance based and extrinsically focused, as we're saying, audiences start getting educated to have the wrong priorities and to equate musical depth with this kind of appearance. And so then you have somebody who would play like a Mazevich or a Rachmaninoff or somebody who, you know, and there are present day pianists as well who, you know, what they're actually looking at is their hands, because they're working and they're controlling what it is that they're doing. And so they're actually paying attention. They're paying attention to the conductor, and they don't have time to indulge in this showmanship, because the attention that takes away from the performance is instead going into the performance, and then you're actually getting something that's much deeper that other people are.
I agree.
I mean, it's
I think it makes it even more powerful. Ballet told me also once, I mean, he heard all the greats, of course, and for him was Hoffman and Rachmaninoff, each in their own way. But he heard Horowitz many times and knew Horowitz, and he said one of the most astounding things he ever experienced was the world premiere of Horowitz's transcription of pictures at an exhibition in Carnegie Hall, which all piano aficionados know.
Yes.
And he said it was the most astounding thing. No one could believe what was coming out of the piano, because also hearing Horowitz live also, which I had the great fortune to do many times, there's not a single recording of Horowitz which gives any idea of the wizardry in the hall.
Yeah.
He was like playing with you.
Yeah.
It was something like someone entering your aura or something, or a sphere, I don't know. But in any case, he said it was so astonishing because all this smoke and, you know, whatever was coming out of the piano, and Horowitz did not move a muscle during all of it. Yeah. And that made it even more amazing. It was something almost eerie, you know?
Well, I mean,
I find that.
Yeah, you can't be distracted by that. So if there's nothing to look at, your other senses open up. And so then actually you have to start listening, because there's actually nothing, or I mean, you can just drift away and start thinking about, you know, what you're going to do after the concert. But, you know, if you do continue to pay attention, you're going to actually start hearing more, because you know, the visual is taking less attention away from. We already have more brain power devoted to the sense of sight than to any other sense. So if that starts drawing attention away from what it is that we're actually listening to, we don't get to notice any of the great.
Right. Because we listen to music, right? We don't watch music. I mean, the visual part is part of it, and that's why certain performers make it and others don't, and that was always the case.
Yes.
Those who made it big were, for the most part, not necessarily handsome or beautiful, but in many cases, yes. You know, certainly striking looking. You know, look at the photos of Liszt or Busoni or some of the others. You know, I mean, they were powerful, good-looking people, and certainly some of the conductors and all that. So of course they had better chances also back then than someone who came on the stage kind of like a, you know, Schmegegi, and it was, you know, like that. That's always been the case, you know. But they still, and that did fool even back then certain parts of the audience. You know, there were always certain people who considered Stokowski, for instance, a charlatan. You know, because he had the whole thing going on with the light, or even Karajan later. Well, I can tell you, Karajan was anything but a charlatan. I mean, Karajan was an incredible musician, and I mean, had the most solid background that no conductor alive today can imagine, certainly no young person, and could play his own rehearsals and could read his score, which many of the young people can't. And the only thing I would criticize about Karajan is perhaps the over commercialization of his later work. Okay, but that's another. But talking about Karajan as no. This was a great musician, and so was Stokowski. Yes, Stokowski could be the showman and try to reach people. But I mean, I've spoken to many people who, it was Stokowski also. The guy had a magic that came from him, you know, and they didn't even know what exactly he was doing to them. He had that charisma. So of course, someone who has that has more chances of a career. You know, that's always been there. There is the visual thing. Toscanini was a beautiful old man and had this incredible intensity, this charisma, but never gave an interview. You know, it came from, again, something internal in him. It wasn't because he had more postings on, you know, Facebook or social media, or because his agent says it. No, he just came out and did his work. Never didn't, you know, it came from inside. I think that's what the whole point of this conversation is maybe about.
Yes.
The sum total of their training, their personalities, their backgrounds, the age in which they lived, the hardships they went through. Most of these people went through world wars. Now we're going through something similar in our own way.
Yeah.
I mean, it's not a world war, but it's, you know, we are in
world crisis.
A world crisis, comparable. But I mean, these people really went through a lot to get to where they were. You know, Horowitz didn't have an immediate success, and they lived for years in flea bag hotels with his agent before they made it. And, you know, everyone who later had a big career had a tough time.
Yeah.
You know, and all of the result of all of this and the people they knew, if you consider that when Toscanini conducted Verdi, this was someone who knew Verdi, who played cello in the first performance of Othello. You know, if you, some Horowitz who knew Rachmaninoff so well, Rachmaninoff knew Tchaikovsky and Anton Rubinstein, Hoffman studied with Anton Rubinstein, the list people, they had connection to this living history, which we don't anymore. And this all came out. So when they made music, it was the sum total of all these experiences, you know, and that's something we don't have today. We don't have this connection to the composers, because the composers are themselves isolated from the mainstream music.
Yes.
To you know, in most cases, that's another subject. But I mean, I remember going with Mstislav Hrozhovsky, who was born in 1892. In 1984, to a McDonald's in Center City, Philadelphia. I invited him, and he said, "Oh, let's go to McDonald's. They have a nice fish sandwich." And it bemused that someone who studied with Leschetizky would like the fish sandwich. So I sat there with him in the middle of all these Center City guys, you know, staying there and talking with slang and all. I'm sitting there with this little tiny man, and just said, "So, master, tell me, did you ever hear Mahler conduct?" "Oh, yes, I heard the world premiere of his Seventh Symphony, but the acoustic was not very good." And did you hear, what was the first time you played with Toscanini, or heard Toscanini conduct, who he later played with several times? "Oh, in 1902 at La Scala, Boeto Mephistopheles with Shaliapin," and so on. "And did you ever hear Busoni play?" "Oh, Mr. Busoni. Ah, Mr. Busoni. Yes, I heard him so many times, But the best time was when he played all the Liszt Transcendental Etudes for us at his apartment. You know, Mr. Szymanowski told me this, Debussy told him this, Monet told him this, Renoir told him this, not just musicians, it's the other part. And then he turned to me like he had this big secret. He didn't want any of these Center City kids to hear this important. So he turned to me and said, with a kind of a chuckle, you know, he said, "You know, Mr. Ravel was not a good pianist." And I felt like saying, "Oh my God, don't let anyone here know that," you know, because and he said, "Because once he brought a piece of his Le Tombe de Couperin for me, the manuscript, and he could not play it, and I had to play it for him." And I'm sitting there with my mouth open, listening to these stories going back 70 years, and you know, and Max Rudolph telling me about Toscanini rehearsals at Bayreuth, and hearing Nikisch conduct the Ring. And this is not just talking about the old days. This was a connection. Nikisch knew Wagner. I mean, you know, Max had lunch with Richard Strauss. I mean, he knew Strauss. He knew Wagner. This was a direct connection to the distant past. And someone growing up today doesn't have that.
We don't have that direct connection, and yet, I mean, the recordings is one thing, but you know, you were mentioning in your post on Facebook just the other day about reading and learning more about these composers, but learning more about these musicians. When I was reading Harold Bauer's biography, I was just thinking, my God, I mean, the insight that's in here when he says that, the London audiences at the end of the 19th century were so superficial that, it was Hans von Bülow. Each concert, there were fewer and fewer people attending because they didn't like the look of the man.
Yeah, yeah.
And he left in a huff and he never went back to London. So this is not new. Or that people were asked to play at musical events in the homes of rich socialites for exposure, and that it's going to be good for your career. And he said, Bauer says, Riley, as he pretty much says everything in his book, I never knew anybody who subjugated their artistry who benefited from such an arrangement. And but hearing that 150 years ago, some of the same things were going on, I think is really useful to look at, the overarching sort of experiences that musicians go through. But then hearing firsthand also from people who did know composers, and even the fact, when I was studying music history, nobody ever said, go read Beethoven's letters and Mozart's letters and Schubert.
Never.
So this is something we do have. So if we don't have the direct personal connection, we can, in an instant, like you were saying, go to YouTube and you can hear, you can go to YouTube, get free, you can get these books where you can read the actual experiences of people who worked with composers or who heard them, or from the composers themselves. And this is something where it's such a disparity right now, I think, between what it is that we have available and then what it is that we're actually hearing put into the musical performance when there's all that richness that could be going into it.
Yes, that's why I posted the other day. If your Facebook watchers want to look at my post, they can.
I'll link to that.
But I mean, we've been talking a lot about the past. And what we have to really be clear about, not everything about the past was golden.
100%.
Hardly. It's not just about the good old days. Not at all. It's not like, everything today is terrible and sterile. No.
Yes.
I think the musicians today we have great musicians. And the technical level is higher than it's ever been in history.
Absolutely.
Technical level. But, not at all talking about everything being great in the past, but when we tried to reproduce things, I remember devouring, memorizing Harold Schoenberg's The Great Pianists, the book, when I was about 12, I memorized that book. Yeah, okay. A lot of things missing from it, and a lot of things I don't agree with these days, but okay. But that was like the Bible back then.
Yes.
And I remember the first time reading about Anton Rubinstein's huge recitals, 8 Beethoven sonatas, 5 Schumann pianos. And then it wasn't until recently, maybe 10 years ago, that I was reading a book, Performing Music in the Age of Recording, which is a brilliant book which everyone should read, Performing Music in the Age of Recording. And there's another book that's titled After the Golden Era.
Yes.
I think, After the Golden Era. And he talks about these recitals of Anton Rubinstein, and I didn't know this until, I was, in my 50s. He didn't just come out and play 8 Beethoven sonatas, No. He would come out, play a Beethoven sonata, take a break, walk around, talk to the audience, go back and play the next sonata.
Wow.
It wasn't like, this rigid thing where everyone's sitting there. Right? And, it would be fun to try and reproduce that. So, I mean, the Beethoven sonata evening then turned into like a 3-hour, thing, and probably some drinking in between. Soiree. And then now I'll go back to the piano and start, the next piece, and then we'll have a drink in the garden, or whatever, and I'll go to, have a drink in between after the hammer flavor or whatever it is. And most people don't know about that. I mean, I didn't find out about it until later. And the fact, for instance, we have today, you have certain people who get all upset if the audience applauds after a movement of a symphony. Well, I mean, sometimes it is annoying for us performers. Certain pieces, yes, you want some silence so you can enter the mood of the next move. Yes, but if you read all of the letters of the great composers, they're all thrilled to bits and writing home or to their or whatever corresponds to like happy children. Oh, each movement of my symphony. was encored, you know, tonight. And back in Mozart's day, Beethoven's day, the symphonies were even broken up. You know, you had 2 movements of a symphony, and then someone came on and sang some coloratura aria, and then whatever else, and then someone came on and did whatever, and then we had the last 2 movements of the symphony. It wasn't this thing. And today we're all taught to be, oh, this is still like you're in a, you know, a cathedral listening to a service. But even back then, the service, like in Bach's day, they weren't all sitting in the, most of them probably left by the time the cantata got there, because the service started at 11 o'clock and the cantata was on around 10 or 11, by which time the rich people were coming in going, oh, hello to whoever, you know, whatever dignitaries in the audience. It wasn't people sitting there like, listening to it. So I love this idea of the applause. You know, certain conductors who give a sermon to the audience because they applaud after the march of the Tchaikovsky Pathétique. But they always did that. Yeah. You know, they do the Toscanini performance. It was certainly not an easy cookie. You know, they applaud. That was considered. If they don't applaud, something's bloody wrong. You know, and you have letters from serious composers, Brahms, Dvorak, all of them writing, you know, Bruckner. It was encored. So you see, we can't reproduce that because the way we're listening and the conditions in which we're listening have nothing to do with the distant past, nor should they.
No, exactly.
You know, but you cannot then turn to an audience and give them a lecture because they're applauding, because the whole point of music, if that, you know, reaches the audience, let them applaud. So you wait a little longer before you begin the finale. You know, let them applaud after their march and the Pathétique symphony.
Yeah.
So yeah, there's a, you know, again, we can go on for hours about these things, and we haven't even touched the tip yet. No. But I'm of course curious to see what comes out of this virus, if it ever ends, when and if and how it ends, and what becomes out of this whole world of music that we've had up until this point. Because I think we can say, I think you probably agree, that this is a turning point, something that's never happened before.
Yeah.
No one has ever experienced this before, you know, in history, something like this. There have been pandemics, there have been world wars, but music continued during the world wars, even sometimes up until the day before the concert hall was bombed or whatever the case. Today, it's been stopped.
Yeah.
So how are we going to all react to that? And also the thousands of incredibly talented and gifted musicians who are now without a forum in which to grow in this. So that's why I suggested.
And also a livelihood. I mean, there's the livelihood. There's just the expression, which, you know, this is why the streaming can, of course, be wonderful in the sense of giving them an avenue and giving them a way to connect. And it doesn't have to be just this. You know, it can be dismissed easily. And yet, I think that we're also going. I'm hoping that people are going to go back to. There's the capacity that we could grow and go back to the shared musical experience with a really renewed appreciation for what that is.
We haven't even touched on the plight of contemporary composers, a number of whom have contacted me, and in complete despair, because it wasn't difficult enough for them to get performances of their works, you know, and I'm talking about composers whose works are certainly approachable, not, you know, out there or whatever, or experimentalists, but people who wrote, you know, successful. Now they lost, now all their performances and commissions are drying up, and all that. And what's going to happen? Don't forget, back then, these people that we're talking about were playing what was largely, up until the 1930s or so at least, contemporary music.
Yes.
You know, with few exceptions. I mean, Stokowski premiered Charles Ives' Fourth Symphony in 1965. You know, he wasn't just conducting the Mozart G minor symphony. You know, many other conductors and pianists. The piano repertoire basically kind of stopped after Prokofiev and Bartók. You know, most successful mainstream performers on piano don't play Stockhausen or even Elia Carter Sonata or whatever, things like that. Barber Sonata, maybe some other, you know, handful of pieces here and there. But what we haven't talked about is composers. Because to have a living music, we have to have living composers. So a lot of it will be the question of how the composers come out of this, who's listening to it, who's going to want to listen. If we're stuck in 2021, let's say, by the time we hopefully get out of this in some way, or maybe later or longer, and if we go right back to only playing, you know, the Waldstein Sonata, the Mozart G minor symphony, and having La Traviata or Carmen, or whatever the case, and you know, only Rachmaninoff and not even any Mettner or Scriabin, or you know what I mean? If we go back to an even more constricted repertoire, in a certain way, this is very fatalistic sounding, I don't think it even matters, because in certain ways, there's not really much more to say about a Waldstein Sonata. What are you going to say? Oh, he played this measure a little quicker, this pedaling was here different, or this and that. But in general, it's gelled into a certain way of performing, even with the early performance, you know, or whatever you want to call it, historically informed movement, which now has become mainstream. It's taught in schools. Yeah. But even there, it's become almost impossible to tell the difference anymore between Group A and Group Z. I mean, when Articourt was first coming up with this recording, it sounded like unlike anyone else. And so did some of the other pioneers of that time, you know, and Gardner and people like that. But today it's, you know, in a way, a dime a dozen. So you're listening to performance of whatever Baroque piece, and it's really, oh, this one inflects that slightly different, but that's not really not changing the piece anymore. No. Again, it's
that's the extrinsic as opposed to intrinsic. Yeah, that's it.
Yeah. So if we don't have modern, contemporary, some kind of contemporary music contributing to our post-COVID world, or at least whatever the word may, you know, being an essential part of it, I think we're in real difficult waters. Right. You know, we just can't keep on listening to recordings from 1920 or 1930 either. And at the end of the day, existentially speaking, what's it going to matter how someone played Brahms in 1890 as opposed to 1990 if we don't have any live things, or if we only have someone, you know, dancing at a piano playing a Brahms intermezzo for us that we've already heard 1,000 times. Yeah. It's going to be a very, very difficult time. So that's why I suggested in my post the other day was aimed more at younger colleagues, but also to listeners, to use this time to, you know, if you really have a profound, deep love of music, or do it for a living, you know, whatever the case is, to try and use this time to go a little deeper into it. And that's the only way to replenish ourselves, you know, otherwise it's really quite dire. So that's what I'm doing every day here in my little room. Yeah. Well,
brilliant ideas, like you said. I mean, we can just go on for hours. It's been an hour and 40 minutes, which is actually pretty.
You're kidding? No. Well, I hope your audience pardons us for our.
Well, we've been getting some wonderful comments. We could actually possibly put one question that was asked was if you would just perhaps, and we can talk about this more another time, but perhaps just if there's something about Boulez, maybe just about his approach, or something about your studies with Boulez that stands out that you'd be able to share.
Yeah, as I said with Boulez, again, I think Boulez was more of a, you know who the greatest, many people don't know this, but he told me this several times. You know who the greatest influence on Boulez was? Not Hoffman, not Rachmaninoff, not Cortot, but Marcel Tabetot, the great French oboist, who was in the Philadelphia Orchestra, who was like the guru of oboists. Boulez, who could play from a full orchestra score, which many conductors today with careers can't. Yeah. And he studied conducting with Fritz Reiner, and Fritz Reiner said, play the piano. But Boulez would play at the classes. Tabetot would hold wind classes at Curtis Hall, Casimir Hall, where Hoffman played. And Boulez would play the rest of the orchestra part on the piano. I did something similar years later with Max Rudolph. When I studied with Max Rudolph, I would play the rest of the orchestra parts, or I'd play all the orchestra parts, and his conducting students would conduct me. You know, so Boulez did the same thing, basically, back then. And he said what he learned about phrasing, everything he learned from phrasing, about phrasing and structure and pacing was from Tabito. And that's a quote. I mean, you know, that's fact. He told me that many times and told other students that, but he would tell me in details. If you listen to ballet, he has a very idiosyncratic way of phrasing, which most people don't. So they just label him a romantic pianist, and that's, you know, all the day. He's not serious like Rao. The biggest nonsense ever. Ballet could play, you know, was playing Schubert late sonatas in Carnegie Hall in 1939. The only other person back then who was doing that was Schnabel. He world premiered many contemporary works. It was not just someone playing flashy pieces. And he could sit down and play Tosca for you, you know, and whatever. But Tabito. So that was one thing that really stuck in my mind, because he said also his lessons with Hoffmann, Godowsky, and Rosenthal didn't really bring much for him. They talked mostly about whatever. He would play a bunch of works for them, and they would go, very good, and that would be the lesson. He said it got to be fun when he would play for Godowsky, and then Heifetz and Albert Einstein would come for lunch, and he would join them. That's when it became fun. Yeah, but so ballet was more. He was a kind of. It was a very introverted person. That BBC masterclass, 1982, that I'm on with him.
Yeah,
I already been with him a number of years, and I was his assistant at the time. And that's not ballet, and that's not me either. I hate my playing there, but of course everyone was tense, and he was very tense. He was giving all kinds of stories, and that was not how he taught. When I would take over his students, they would say, "Oh, you talk much more than ballet." And I said, "Yeah, but all you have to do is listen to him." "Yeah, but he didn't explain." That's not how he taught. That masterclass is not. He was very introverted, very taciturn, and I would say the greatest things from ballet was when he would sit down at the piano and just play for me, and I would absorb things. And I wrote about that in my liner notes for the Marston release of Live George Ballet. You know, I wrote the liner notes. And ballet, I think, had a little bit of the makeup of Leopold Godowsky, who he ironically studied with. We would finish a lesson, and he would say, "Do you have time?" No, I don't. Of course I do. You know, yeah. "Do you have time? I would like to play something for you." And he would sit down and play the Rager Telemann variations for me, and my mouth just dropping. My audition for him was at Bloomington, and he said, "I would like to hear a Chopin etude." And I said, "Okay." So then I said, "You get."
yeah.
Sorry. But anyway, and I knew, you know, and I turned around, he had this huge grin on his face, and then ran to the second piano and played me his entire CD of Godowsky. I mean, before it was a CD, the entire program. And I was, you know, I mean, this is after having heard Horowitz and Galels and Richard. I mean, I was just blown away. I'd never heard anything like that. It was more subtle. It was a bit, but what he did there. And then when the recording came out, I was almost in tears. I said, "This is not what I heard.
I know.
This is not what I heard. This is what?" And that would happen many times. He played the Rachmaninoff Chopin variations for me, and even demonstrating, you know, the pieces at my lessons. But oftentimes, I once played the Godowsky transcription of the Invitation to the Dance for him, which is a monster. And we had a ball. I remember that session. We had a ball, you know, or I would play the Künstlerleben for him, which he studied with Godowsky. We had like a party.
Wow.
We would be going back and forth. And then he would play it a couple nights later in Curtis Hall. You know, everything controlled, everything there, but 50% of what I lost. And then when the recording would come out of whatever work, like the Rachmaninoff Chopin variations, that's, I would say, 30% of what I heard in the studio. So he had that element. I think there were times live where he really did let loose, let the genie out of the bottle, or the demon, whatever you want to call it, the sensualist even. I think that's most clear on the Live at Carnegie Hall disc, some of the recordings from the 70s, and certainly on that 6 CD collection of Marston, Ballet Volume 2, not the first volume of Chopin,
Yeah.
But the second one,
Second volume.
some astonishing
I'll
things.
post the link in
Yeah.
the
Yeah, they should really listen to that. That's more Boulez. So he was, I think, someone that I just absorbed things from.
Mm-hmm.
It wasn't because he taught me to play a certain way. He didn't do that to any of his students. You know, they all had different varying levels. And that was great for me, that period, because that's when I began to realize, you know, this what was lacking in the students. Like someone bringing a Schubert sonata to me and playing it like like cardboard. And then I would say, do you know the Winterreise, or do you know Schwannegesang or the string quintet? I said, no. Do you know the other sonatas in this volume? No. You told me to learn this one. Yeah, but don't you even turn the page out of curiosity? Well, why don't you know? Well, I don't have your memory. I said, no, you don't have my memory. I have a very good memory, but I've been working on it, well, wow, for 50 years. But back then, you know, for 20 years, they were not curious. Or they would play an accompaniment to a Brahms concerto. Excuse me. You know, or, yeah. Like that. Let me play a... And I said, wait a minute, who's playing there? Oh, I don't know. I said, it's a French horn. Didn't you look at the score? No. I said, you don't even have to look at the score. You're playing from a two-piano reduction, and it says horn. And then the piano comes in. Yeah. So then you play different, play the. He didn't know, so I sent him home, and I did that a number of times to some of them. And then years later, I got letters from them. Thank you, you opened my eyes. Boulez would not do that.
Yeah.
But he would bitch at his apartment to me. Oh, these kids, they don't know. I wasn't going to ask him, so why don't you say anything? You know, because he hated it, you know. But he would not come out and be tough. Anyway, he would just say, play that quieter. But I would like really get in their case and like, you know, go home. You know, go home and study. Right. And so he had a lot of things and experiences bottled up. Sometimes he would open up and let me know certain magical things. I remember him saying the most incredible thing, well, of course, Hoffman and people like that. He said he never got ever hearing Backhaus play the Chopin Opus 10 No. 2 Etude in Havana in 1926, 6 or 7 or whatever. He said it was the most astonishing thing ever. And then he didn't know the recording of Backhaus playing that. I put it on. He said, yes, that's it. That's it. Which is astonishing even today with all of our technical wizardry. So it was more, again, the same thing of kind of this osmosis of passing something on. Max Rudolph was the same way. You know, somehow him telling me how the difference between Toscanini's Parsifal and Karl Muck's Parsifal, you know, it made a more profound impression on me than telling us how to beat, you know, a fermata or something. I don't remember Boulez ever making a comment about technique, ever. Or occasionally he would, you know, say, put the pedal here or begin this crescendo a little less, you know, things like, or balances between the hands, you know, really that the left hand doesn't need as much power as the right hand, obviously, because of the physiognomy of the piano, the sound, things like that. But I mean, rarely. So he and Hoffman was the same kind of teacher, I know, you know. It wasn't much, it wasn't, as Liszt was, it was more of a, you read the Liszt master classes, you know, he would say, go do your dirty laundry at home. There was no talk of technique. It was projection. It was cultural background. It was things like that. And I think that's how it should be. Yeah. You know, agree. But that presupposes a certain amount of work on the of the student or the receptivity of the audience. You know. But I would recommend that everyone who thinks they know Boulez certainly forget 75% of the Decca recordings. Just toss them out. Yep. The only one that gives an idea, even is a little staid at moments, is the Schubert list. Yeah. The song transcriptions. That's right. And that's about it, unfortunately, from the Decca. But if you want to really hear Boulez play, get some of the recordings from the 70s, or go listen to some of these pirate things. Yes. There's a couple of marvelous posts, YouTube, of his last recitals in Carnegie Hall, where he he kind of transcended himself or something. Then there's another element in playing. Those are also from the very last year, maybe because he was also dying of cancer. I just had a photo here. I'm probably the only person in the world who has it. A photo of him in the nursing home shortly before dying of cancer, emaciated, completely white hair. But often when one gets sick, the music goes to another level. You saw that in conductors like Abbado or Ferenc Frickshire or Clara Haskell.
Mm-hmm.
The music making becomes spiritualized. So I think the last years of ballet sometimes are very slow, but they go to a different spiritual plane. But I think the best collection is this six CD set on Marston.
Agreed.
Yeah.
That's a whole other level, for sure. We'll
Yeah,
have to talk more about him another time, and as well as all these other topics.
Well, anytime you want, or anytime your public can stand it.
Yeah.
By blabbing.
We've been getting some great comments over here. We can address some of them afterwards just by typing some responses.
Sure.
Thank you so much for sharing
thank you for having me.
Wisdom. It's just been so meaningful, and really, I always just get so inspired by this connection and this prioritization of that intrinsic that you're speaking of, because I think that's really what it is that we all are really drawn to music by. And
yes.
Our culture is not really prioritizing that, and I think we're looking for it. But I think we are very lucky, as you said. We have access to these recordings. We have access to books and scores and things that we are very fortunate right now and should take advantage.
Yeah, absolutely. I just thought that that's our only resource at the moment, but it's a huge resource.
Yeah.
So I hope that musicians and music lovers take advantage of it and at least get an idea, put our times into perspective, to put any value judgment on any time, but at least know the differences. Music making did not begin in 1980 or 1990, or even in 1870.
Or just to assume that it was whatever's now is inherently better than it was back then, and that's just the way they did.
No.
Not at all.
Go read what Anton Schindler wrote about Beethoven playing one of his Opus 14 sonatas. The first few measures were in tempo, the rest was quite, free and all that. I mean, go and look up at these things, and then next time you listen to a great pianist playing, and think, how close is that to accounts of Beethoven himself playing, or Liszt, or Chopin? Why are there sometimes 5 different versions of a Chopin work? Which one's the urtext? Which one's the right one? They were always changing.
Yeah.
Mozart's concertos that he wrote for his students to play are quite different than the concertos he wrote for himself to play.
Right.
Compare K450, for instance, to K413 or 453, just technically speaking. These are things that I think are important to know.
Yes.
And imagine that Mozart playing, this was like, at that time, the equivalent of Horowitz playing a concerto. Yeah. So, they're immediately more virtuosic.
Yes.
And you can imagine him improvising kind of a wild cadenza. Mm-hmm. These are things that enrich us, and it's all out there in the web now.
Yeah.
So, good luck to everybody.
And it's thanks to the web that we're able to do this in 2 different parts of the world and reaching people all over the world. So there are advantages to
Vancouver to Brasilia, yeah. So good luck to everybody, and stay safe, stay healthy.
Indeed.
And let's use the music to help us.
Yes, and to be continued. Thank you so much.
Okay.
Ian. Thank you.
Bye-bye.